Good afternoon. Originally, this contribution to the workshop was, can you hear me? Sorry. Yes, was meant to be a report from one of the project team partners, the Centro Manoscritti of the University of Pavia, and was supposed to be delivered, of course, by its director, Professor Antonietta Grignani. Maria Antonietta sends her regards and has asked me to express a regret at not being here with us today due to her poor health. Nevertheless, she hopes to meet the project partners and continue conversation at Yale in the autumn. The object of my contribution, as you can see from the title of the paper, is both daunting and exhilarating, and this is due to the fact that it's difficult to condense in a few minutes the extent and range of archival collections available to the Italian speaker and Italian-speaking user in Italy, and the role and place held within this rich and varied landscape of tangible cultural heritage by what we have now learned to define as diasporic collections. And to an extent, this sense of vertigo is heightened by the fact that diasporic collections are just a drop in the ocean of archival holdings that Italy possesses, and a small fraction of the archival patrimony that numerous state-sponsored, state-owned institutions, alongside numerous public-private partnerships and private archives, are safeguarding daily for posterity. And I need to make a small aside on the notion of diaspora and diasporic, because there is a marked distinction between the intrinsically diasporic nature of the archival holdings and manuscripts that Italy has, stretching from the Greek-Roman time to 1860, the year in which we unified as a country, because we were dominated by several foreign countries, and then the intrinsically monological character of the literary manuscripts that were collected and were produced and then collected after the unification. And so you understand now why we need to make that distinction. As we understood from yesterday's discussions and today's discussions, the very nature of a diasporic collection tells us a story of displacement, the story of a journey, a story that can and must be usefully told and that can shed light onto the mechanics of national identity, the role played by cultural heritage in our understanding of national identity, and how this is refracted in literary practices forged through linguistic experimentation, not only in the standard language, but also in the languages of the dominators and the substandard variations. And these experimentations reflect, in turn, more perilous and often life-changing crossings. It can be useful at this point to paint in very broad strokes, very broad, and actually I apologize because I'm both an imposter in the sense that I'm representing someone else here, but also an intruder. I'm not an archivist, of course. I admire your work enormously, so this is the user's perspective on the history of archival building in Italy. And so it is useful to paint in very broad strokes the archival context in which diasporic collections come into being within the Italian context. It is often said that Italians are a people of poets, navigators, and saints. Not many people know that actually this is the opening line of Mussolini's speech. He broadcast this speech in 1935. When he needed to inform the nation that Italy would start a campaign of colonization in Ethiopia, one of the most horrible, shameful pages of the history of my country. As you can see, we are a people of poets, of artists, of heroes, of saints, of thinkers, of scientists, of navigators, and transmigrators. This is a euphemism to say essentially that for many centuries, Italians left the country because of hardship. And in the fascist rhetoric, there's some element that cannot be, that attracts our attention. We are first and foremost a people of poets, okay? This means that because of the emphasis placed on literature alongside religion and the exploration and mapping of the globe as a marker of national identity, the Italian intellectual elite, and I stress it's elite, even before the Italian nation became independent from the yoke of a number of foreign rulers in 1860, worked eagerly towards the painstaking construction of numerous sites of learning, whether public or private, that functioned also as a repository of material documents charting the evolution of these institutions, of the universities, museums, circles, but also over the years and centuries attracted the deposit of manuscripts and highly precious libraries. The practice of literary writing in a language different from the ones of the dominators, alongside the creation of repositories where these writings were preserved and, of course, studied and disseminated for centuries, was our way to declare our independence of spirit, even though we were subjected to political domination from a foreign ruler, actually more than one. When asked to contribute to this workshop on behalf of the University of Pavia, I attempted a mapping or counting the number of manuscripts available for consultation in the main national libraries with no chronological limitation. And I realized the impossibility of this task when I gleaned that in the National Library in Rome alone, there are circa 2 million manuscripts dating back to the Greek-Roman time, and that several of which have been digitized and are available for online study. And in the light of the peculiar evolution of the Italian state, the weight carried within the education system at the national libraries, museums, and university institutions, amongst the oldest in the world, it is not surprising that collections and curating policies have been consolidated over decades, if not centuries, and in some cases, especially in the 20th century, they diversified to a great extent. And now, I've listened with great interest about the plea for essentially financial aid and training. And this is something, it may surprise you, but this happens in Italy as well, in the sense that because of our responsibility towards the heritage that we have, both material and immaterial, the lion's shares of financial support is attracted by oldest documents. And so, since the emphasis of this network is on comparably more recent documents, you will understand that also, you know, the preservation of 19th century, 20th century, 21st century manuscripts is more volatile than one would expect. With more than 800 archival institutions that preserve 19th century, 20th century, 21st century literary material that is now considered of national importance dotting the peninsula, it is fair to say that Italians, therefore, are not only a people of saints, navigators, and poets, but also increasingly so of archivists. Our responsibility towards the heritage that we safeguard for posterity and for the world, indeed, this is enshrined also in the Italian Constitution. The Article 9 of the Constitution declares that the Republic will safeguard the historical and cultural patrimony of the nation. And since 1998, this article has been extended to include also the patrimony that, that archives and libraries are. This is just to say that our legal framework, considering our past, has only recently looked at archives as something that we need to preserve. And this, the evolution of this legal framework was taken forward in 1939 by the fascist regime with the declaration, a so-called Declaration of Particular Interest. That is, at some point, the fascist regime essentially realized the importance of safeguarding archives and imposed on private citizens the requirement of declaring the archives that they owned, and also imposed the rule of indivisibility of the archives and the ban on trade. And of course, this is due to the fact that we needed to preserve the cultural heritage from looting, and it's still happening, by the way. So these are, this is a legal framework that has been extended to 20th century material, but that was created primarily to protect and defend material that dates back to several centuries ago. The object of my presentation will not look at the literary production of the diasporic Italian movements that brought several Italians, well, thousands of Italians to the United States, to Canada, Australia, Argentina, and Brazil. And actually I was touched by Lillian's presentation because of your reference to Greater Cuba. That is, if I understood correctly, it is the Cuba outside Cuba, isn't that so? Because we call that equivalent Little Italy. So it's quite interesting. So since the emphasis is placed in this project on 20th century and 21st century literary practice, I will limit myself to tell the story of a few diasporic collections. Say alone, the diasporic collections tell a story of a journey, and interestingly, the journey that I'm about to tell starts in Alexandria in Egypt. And if you can, oh, sorry, this is just a list of the most important archives preserving 20th century literary materials and manuscripts. The Centro per la Tradizione Manoscritta in Pavia, the Archivio Bonsanti Gabinetto Viesseux in Florence, and the Archivio del Novecento at the University of Rome. As I said, the story begins in Alexandria. Alexandria, in the 19th century, was a very cosmopolitan city, and still is, with highly ambitious foreign bourgeoisie. And in this context, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, the founder of the avant-garde movement Futurism, was born in 1876 to a highly educated and unconventional parents. Marinetti's father was a lawyer from Piedmont, and his mother was a daughter of a literary professor from Milan. They had both come to Egypt in 1865 at the invitation of Khedive Ismail Pasha to act as legal advisors for foreign companies that were taking part in his modernization program. In the same city, and a few years later, in 1888, but in a different social and economic context, the poet Giuseppe Ungaretti, was born, and to parents that relocated to Alexandria in the hope to have a better future than in the native Tuscany. Ungaretti's father worked on the digging of the Suez Canal, where he suffered a fatal accident in 1890, and his widowed mother, born in today's Montenegro, ran a bakery on the edges of the Sahara. Marinetti and Ungaretti attended the same lycée, were schooled in French, and both dreamed of Paris as the city where to fulfill their literary ambitions. Marinetti published the Futurist Manifesto in Le Figaro in 1909, at his expense. And Ungaretti instead frequented literary circles and befriended several symbolist poets, and we have conspicuous literary material testifying to that, to those friendships. Both Ungaretti and Marinetti wrote their first works in French, published them in Paris. A plaquette of French poems constitutes the first nucleus of L'Allegria, Joy, the collection that will encapsulate Ungaretti's experience as a World War I soldier. And Ma Farca le Futuriste is the novel that allegorizes the birth of the movement and was famously written in French by Marinetti. Perhaps because both authors were born abroad, because both authors became fervent nationalists, and both authors supported the burgeoning fascist movement and struck a personal relationship with Benito Mussolini, the dictator. Marinetti will die in 1944 after having traveled the world to promote his brand of organized artistic avant-garde, and while writing a collection of poems praising the wartime achievements of the Italian Commando Frogman unit of the Italian Royal Navy, created during the fascist regime. I say this because in 2014 there are a number of huge exhibitions of futurist art that will, they started at MoMA and will continue to take place throughout the world. Despite critical acclaim, Ungaretti struggled financially and joined the many thousands of Italians in their exodus to find a better life abroad. In 1936, while being already in Brazil, was offered a professorship in Italian at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and stayed there till 1942 when he was offered a professorship at the University of Rome. Despite the brevity of the Brazilian experience, Ungaretti remained very connected to the Brazilian modernist circles, and this circumstance is reflected in his personal archive. Ungaretti's literary papers were acquired in 2001 by the Gabinetto Viesseux in Florence at the 100,000 euros. And the exploration of this vast personal archive requires a linguistic expertise that spans Italian, French, German, and Portuguese, because Ungaretti lived, wrote, and established meaningful and long-lasting intellectual relationships in a number of countries. In this archive, one will find not only, of course, the manuscripts pertaining to all this published work, but also sizable correspondence with a number of literary and intellectual figures such as Paul Valéry, André Gide, and Ezra Pound. But also the Brazilian poets Oswald and Mário de Andrade, whom he befriended during his Brazilian experience. Interestingly, the Brazilian component of the Ungaretti collection is not limited to the letters that Ungaretti exchanged with the Andrades, but also original creative pieces that were sent as gifts from Oswald and Mário de Andrade to Ungaretti for his translating or for comment. The Ungaretti papers in Florence tell a story of displacement. It is reflected not only in the languages used, in the places where the poetry was conceived and composed, but also in the letters exchanged with a number of intellectuals, and in the conspicuous original poetry and fiction that the poet received from French and Brazilian poets, texts that are now safeguarded amongst these papers in Florence. The story told by the Marinetti archive is equally multilingual, as we have seen. The trajectory of this archive takes us from Rome, the seat of the main Marinetti residence and home to his personal archive, to Yale and Los Angeles. And I'm sure that Kevin perhaps later on can elucidate on some aspects of this travel, of this journey. The most important Marinetti papers are located at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library in Yale and the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. And it is certainly, and it is a certainty that numerous Marinetti papers are in the hands of private collectors, and we know that some important papers, the so-called Libroni, are still in his Roman mansion. We still don't know exactly what is kept there, though. A recently published edition of Marinetti's works, maybe if you can go, forward. Well, this is an example that you can find on the Yale portal of the papers that Marinetti produced. Well, an edition that was recently published in 2013 was based on a manuscript that is currently preserved in non-specified private collection in Milan. The Marinetti archive in Yale was acquired in 1977, sold by the Marinetti family, and access was made available to the users only in 1992. The Marinetti holdings at the Getty are divided into 3 distinct archives acquired in 3 different moments and from different traders. We have the Filippo Tommaso Marinetti correspondence and paper, 1886-1944, composed by papers acquired between 1984 and 1989, directly from the Marinetti family, and from Luigi Scrivo, Marinetti's secretary, from 1930 onwards. Marinetti student notebooks and other papers, essentially the papers that he produced in Alexandria, and these materials were acquired in 1989. The provenance is unknown, but one can infer that they were kept in the family archive and then sold at a later stage, perhaps because Yale didn't want them. I'm not so sure. And the papers of Marinetti and Benedetta Cappa Marinetti, his wife, who was also a very interesting futurist artist, which were acquired in 1992. The mapping of Marinetti correspondence, something that one should do, is more difficult to trace, as one finds the presence of Marinetti letters in several archives specialized in Italian modernism in Italy and abroad, with the largest holding located in the Primo Conti Foundation in Fiesole, an archival institution that is entirely devoted and specialized to the collection of futurist art, manuscripts and painting. And there you can find the largest nucleus of Marinetti's correspondence, with 340 letters. The story of Ungaretti and Marinetti's collections is essentially a story of continental modernism, and it's rich, both physical and symbolic, beyond the old continent. But these are not the only examples I should like to draw your attention to. For instance, and rapidly, if you, well, this is a manuscript by Ungaretti and Oswald de Andrade. Yes, go ahead. Next one. Yeah. Here we go. So, the point is that the story of Italian migration during the first half of the 20th century, during the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century is not only the story of the movements of people, but also the story of the movements of the tangible cultural objects that these people brought with them and that symbolize their attachment to the homeland or Greater Italy. The modernist poet Dino Campana sought to find a better life in Argentina, contributed, like many Italians, to the construction of railways in that opportunity-rich country. Many Italians established their happy lives at some point after many sacrifices and hardship. The Italian community of Buenos Aires became so affluent that they bought a precious manuscript of Dante's Divine Comedy. In the 1930s, attempts were made to bring that manuscript back to Italy, but in the 1950s, it was agreed that the manuscript should stay in Buenos Aires as a tangible memento of Italian cultural identity to be fully enjoyed by both the Italian and the Argentinian community. Campana's Argentinian writings were instead successfully acquired by the Gabinetto Viesseux in Florence and constitute a sizable collection in their contemporary literature section alongside the papers of Nobel Prize winners Eugenio Montale and Salvatore Quasimodo. The return of modern Italian diasporic manuscripts to the homeland is both the signal of efficient collection policies and a reflection of the author's wish for their papers to be safeguarded in institutions such as the Gabinetto Viesseux and the Centro Manoscritti in Pavia, which increasingly over the years have reached to pantheon-like status. Everybody wants to keep their papers there, essentially. Well, all the Italian authors want to keep their papers there. After having traveled from Alexandria to Paris to São Paulo and Buenos Aires, let me now conclude with a Reading story. Writer and academic Luigi Meneghello left Italy in 1947, soon after the war. He was born in 1922, the year in which Mussolini seized power with the ominous March on Rome. Meneghello's fascist education literally broke to pieces when war destroyed the country, and thus revealing with painful and tragic consequences the ineptitude of the regime. Meneghello joined the resistance in 1943 and fought alongside British soldiers against both Nazis and fascists in northern eastern front of the country. The elation at the prospect of building a free country in 1945 ceased abruptly when he realized that several exponents of the fascist regime would be left in place by US-backed administration and had quickly become fearful of the increasing prestige of the communist political forces in the country. The Cold War had begun, and United Kingdom became an appealing alternative. Meneghello came to Reading with a British Council scholarship. He started to work with T.H.A. Hodges, his supervisor at the philosophy department, on a study exploring the influence of Italian idealism on R.G. Collingwood. Meneghello became increasingly drawn to the eccentric and intellectually stimulating personalities of the English department of the time, especially Donald J. Gordon, the writer John Wayne, and the critic Frank Kermode, and started contributing to the teaching on the English department. The Department of Italian that grew out of that academic experience in 1960 and that he directed till 1980 carried, as it still does in its DNA, an ethic of education and scholarship that was directly linked to its founder's personal experience of the resistance as a process of education. In Reading, Meneghello wrote most of his fiction and his large essay production. In 1964, he published the novel I piccoli maestri, Les Petits Maîtres, or The Outlaws. It was translated into English in 1967. And this novel was the result of his own personal fictionalization of his own experience as a resistance fighter. As he will say in his preface to the English edition of the novel published in 1867, I wrote this book only when I was able to forgive myself for having believed to the fascist lie. Meneghello left in deposit a number of manuscripts to the University of Reading, which were later acquired by the Centro Manoscritti in Pavia following his wish, and that's why we have an Italian dimension to this project. To this day, the largest holdings of Meneghello papers are safeguarded in Pavia, but Reading still retains the original manuscripts of several of his books. And these are his 1964 resistance novel, I piccoli maestri, the manuscript of the English translation of this novel done by Rayleigh Trevelyan, a translation which is heavily annotated by Meneghello, and led to a second edition of the Italian edition of the novel, where significant excisions were made as a direct result of Meneghello's own involvement involvement in the translation. Reading preserves also the manuscripts related to Meneghello's pedagogical essays. For instance, Fiori Italiani, Italian Flowers, where he reflected on the dangers of fascist education, and he speaks about the education that he learned to impart in Britain as a kind of antidote to fascist rhetoric. And then we have the Matter of Reading, the 1980 Lectio Magistralis, which was written both in Italian and English, which is essentially an intellectual history of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities of the University of Reading from 1947 to 1980. So it's there already, Alison. Most importantly, Reading has a manuscript related to the 1993 novel Il Dispatrio. The title of this novel is an Italianization of the word dispatriation, a word coined by Henry James in the essay The Storyteller at Large, Mr. Henry Hartland. The novel fictionalizes Meneghello's own experience of the alien landscape and culture of post-war England while charting his creation of the Italian department at Reading, and it is in itself a small anthropological essay on that exotic and yet terribly intriguing figure that is the British academic. Il Dispatrio was written in Italy, and so basically it goes this way, that Meneghello wrote his Italy-based novels in Reading and then wrote about Reading while being in Italy. And interestingly, this novel is, if you will, the only exemplar of the campus novel genre in the 20th century Italian literature, and interestingly set not in Italy but in Reading. Il Dispatrio tells the story of a journey more than one way. Meneghello was not the only Italian academic to flee to England soon after the war. Distinguished philologist Carlo Dionisotti became professor at Bedford College in London the same years when Meneghello came to Reading, and when Silvio D'Antreve became chair of Italian at Oxford. To all these academics, the experience of England and of distance from Italy was central for a reconfiguration of the Italian literary history. The experience of being other in a foreign context led them to rethink the role of multiculturalism in the Italian literary landscape, to rethink the role played by standard dialect or standard language in the Italian literary identity and context, and to rethink the relationship between standard Italian with other Romance languages spoken and written in the peninsula. Dionisotti's most famous essay, Geography and History of Italian Literature, was read at the British Academy in 1950. In this essay, effectively dismantled the vision of a monolingual literary tradition so eagerly promoted by the fascist regime in favor of a reading that acknowledged the existence of alternative and competing centers of literary production, in short, not only Florence, but Rome, Milan, Naples, and Palermo, in a time, the Renaissance, when the idea of standard language was hotly contested and led to the adoption of the variety used by Dante, Tuscan. In this period, alongside standardization, an equally exciting process was taking place, a process that led to experimentations where Tuscan variety was, the Tuscan variety that would provide the basis for standard Italian was hybridized with other Romance languages spoken and written in the peninsula. And Dionisotti could do this because he had access to manuscripts not only written in Tuscan, but also in other varieties of Romance languages that had been preserved for centuries in Italian libraries. And so another confirmation, if needed, that archives are important. It is from this rich multilingual tradition, long silenced by the fascist regime and by official literary histories of the time, that Meneghello's multilingual writing takes its inspiration and its aesthetic and historical justification. His creative writing combines learned Italian with native Venetian alongside English and the English dialects. His long-standing engagement with translation led him to translate Shakespeare, Yeats, and Hopkins, amongst the many, in Venetian dialect. The story told by his manuscripts is the story of a dispatriation that allowed him and others to see their own country and history with different clarity. The presence of these linguistically variegated manuscripts in Pavia, alongside the papers of other prestigious Italian authors, is the permanent testament not only to the individuality of creative genius, but also to a community of writers and speakers that accepts multilingualism as deliverance from the untenable monoglot hegemony, rather than a threat to the fictional foundational narratives of identity. And I'd like to end by showing you the quote that gave the title to the last novel by Meneghello from Harry James, The Storyteller at Large, where Harry James says, if it was perfectly true earlier in the century, in a larger world, I speak of the globe itself, that the writer was up to paint, some sentences. Oh, sorry, I can't read properly. Okay, I'll leave it here for you to read rather than read it myself, because the glaring is very strong. Anyway, thank you very much.